Okay. All right. Good morning, everybody. I think we'll get started so we can make the most of the time we have. Come on in. So thank you all for joining. We have about an hour of sort of material, 45 minutes to an hour of material, and then we'll have about 45 minutes for breakout groups discussion. We'll try and apply what we learned in a scenario. Okay. So this is called Secrets to Running a CL Service Without an MBA. It's co-sponsored by the CLP Division Directors Special Interest Group and the Business of CL Psychiatry Subcommittee. I will introduce the speakers in a moment. I'm going to present just a few introductory words on the question of what management skills are most important to CL directors. Not that everyone here is a CL director necessarily, but the CL Directors Division Group was really founded out of some analysis of what was important to them. And this is one of the topics that we were particularly interested in. So my name is Brian Bronson. I'm one of the vice chairs at Stony Brook University in Long Island, and I'm also the director of the CL service. I have nothing to disclose. So we conducted this survey. This was really like a couple months before the COVID pandemic started. It was the last time actually we all met in person for this CL meeting. And we were founding a new group for Consultation-Liaison Psychiatry directors. The point was to provide a sort of a shared mentorship, right? Support, help people with sort of managing things, since a lot of people are in managerial roles, but don't necessarily have training or expertise. So we created this group, and knowing that we were going to have our first meeting of the group in November 2019, I quickly created a survey, and we sort of tried to email it out to everyone who had registered for the first meeting. And the goals of this were to try and figure out, well, how much experience do people in CL director roles really have? Because I think we assume if you're a director of a division, you have to have a lot of experience, but we'll see the results of that. Which management tasks are most important to them in their day-to-day roles as directors? Which tasks are they most and least confident in that directorship? And which of their sort of professional, educational experiences have most supported their development as leaders? So we sent this out. We so quickly sent it out to everyone who had registered for the forum. There were 48 people at that point who had signed up for the first meeting. A little over half responded. And most of them had been in practice for at least 6 years. But what was interesting is that the most common category in terms of how many years have you been a director, 44% had been a director between 1 and 5 years. So relatively new in that role, which was interesting. And then this was also really interesting, although not surprising, was 37% had no prior training in leadership and management, which we know happens, right? We're thrown into a role where we have to sort of lead people or direct people, but the assumption, this even happens with chairs, right? The assumption is, well, they're great researchers, right? Or they're great running programs, but they don't necessarily know what to do. So that was important also to look at. I won't go into the details of this. It's been published if you're interested in the ACLP journal. But I think the most important finding was then we asked them to rate on a 1 to 7 point scale which of the tasks that we provide them with are most important to you as a director in your day-to-day work. And the strongest rating was for demonstrating the value of your service. So anyone that's in a position of trying to grow a service, right? You can't grow a service if you don't demonstrate value to your service, right? We just assume we know it's important, right? We know there's a lot of patients who need our service. It's very clear to us. But clinical need is not really what drives necessarily investing resources into program, right? We would think that clinical need should be the number one factor, but if you're running a hospital, you have to look at the finances and what are your major strategic goals for the system at large. So ultimately, most people were struggling with this idea, and it's still an ongoing struggle in CL psychiatry. How do I demonstrate value of my service so I can grow it? There was a lot of other things which I won't get into because it's not the focus of our presentation today. But that was a striking finding. So then the other question was, well, we looked at how many years or how much training, management or leadership training that the responders had, and then we correlated that with how confident they were in various sort of leading various tasks. So the question was, well, does management training or actually help people in any way, or is it correlate with being more confident as leaders and directors? So the correlations were the more sort of management or leadership training you had, the more confident you were demonstrating the value of your service, the more confident you were in developing novel models of service delivery, the more confident you were in measuring clinical productivity, and the more confident you were in growing a new service. So with these sorts of things in mind, there have been a number of presentations that the CL Directors Special Interest Group has sponsored, geared on this idea. How do we help people to be more confident in growing a service, right, and demonstrating the value of their service? So that's the spirit of this talk. And then, of course, the business of CL Psychiatry Subcommittee is also interested in similar things. So it was a great overlap to do a joint sponsors symposium. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly introduce the speakers, and then they'll come up one at a time. So all the speakers have been in positions of being CL directors. Stephanie Cho will be the first speaker. She's at the Keck School of Medicine at USC. She will provide some sort of foundational information on business concepts, administrative concepts, understanding who are the key stakeholders that you need to engage to obtain support for growing your service and their roles in healthcare administration. Honor Dickerman is at New York Presbyterian Hospital, Weill Cornell Medicine. Then she'll go from the sort of the foundational stuff to thinking about metrics, because if you're going to develop a service, you need to have metrics to demonstrate value. So how to select and track quality metrics when advocating for more staff, and also how to incorporate trainees in service development and administration. Mara Ackerman is at NYU Langone Health. She'll actually provide an example of actually using metrics in real time, using a dashboard that they developed to sort of routinely correct operational outcomes and metrics, and use that then to make the case for going to leadership and obtaining more lines and more support. And then we're going to take all the things that you've been presented, and we'll sort of have you put it into action in a case discussion. Cheryl Fleisch is from University of Florida College of Medicine, and she's going to present a brief case scenario. And which you'll be putting the question of how are you going to take the data that she presents, the RVUs, the staffing, the dollars, and how do you actually take that? And then how do you make the case to negotiate for more staff? So with that in mind, I will ask Stephanie to come up. Let me just put your slides up here and we'll get started. And if you want to go back to the regular mode, you have to put it back.
All right, so I'm Stephanie Cho, and I have no disclosures, but I have a disclaimer that I'm not an MBA. Hopefully it updated on the system, but in case, you can download the update slides either with the QR code or the link should be in what was uploaded before. Okay, so you want to make a difference. You're either now a new CL chief, you're coming on to a new CL service, and you're excited, you're bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and you're going to make a difference. How? You need a business plan. It's not so different from what we're used to doing clinically, but you need to think about what you want to do. Why is it worth doing? And then how you're going to do it in pretty good detail. The things that over time we've sort of learned is that's all important, but what's going to make it effective is knowing your audience. Who do you actually need to convince? Who's the one who makes the decisions? What are their priorities and values? And how can you talk to them? Learning the lingo. Also knowing your service. How is it funded? Is it profitable? And how are you performing? So let's start with your audience. Who are your stakeholders? Start within your department. Look at your own department leadership. This is an example of an organizational chart. Know where you are on this, so you actually know who you would go to, who your supervisor is, and kind of what the next steps are beyond them, because it's going to take a couple steps to make change. Also know who else is in your department who can help you. Finance directors, business strategy directors, they hold a wealth of information and they would love to talk to you. I can guarantee you, if you go find them in your department, they will be so thrilled that you actually want to understand your service. Also, look outside your department. Who are your colleagues in the other disciplines that benefit from your service and who know your value and will go to bat for you? They are some of your most, prominent, most important allies in this. And then, of course, there's the C-suite. So a chief executive officer is the highest ranking executive in an institution. They're the ones who guide the overall vision, the strategy, the policy. Under them are their right-hand people, the chief operating officer. A COO can vary depending on the institution and the culture, but typically they're like the second in command. They're the ones who really manage the day-to-day operations. If what you're wanting to do is operational, that might be the person who's going to be kind of the last step versus the CFO. They're the ones who make sure that your institution stays financially solvent and doesn't go under, right? They're the ones who are going to look at the numbers of your plan and see, is it going to work or not? The chief medical officer and the chief quality officer. So CMOs used to be kind of just a well-respected physician who worked to try to get attending staff on board with administrative policies. But in the last 10 to 20 years, it's really come into its own as a true executive. Now CMOs work with the rest of the executive team to truly align clinical goals with business ones. A lot of what a chief quality officer used to do, what a chief quality officer does used to be under a CMO, but now there's just too much to do. And quality is so important that it's increasingly being recognized on its own for what it is. And so your CQO is going to be the one who wants to ensure that your hospital is giving the highest quality clinical services it can. If you're looking to improve quality, that's probably the person who's going to be your best bet. So what are their priorities? One way to find out is looking at your key performance indicators or your KPI. These are quantifiable measures of performance that you can use to monitor your service and how it's doing. You can use to look at trends in your hospital and areas of need. And one of the most important things about KPI is that you can use it to create evidence-based arguments to support your initiative in whatever you want to do. And that's incredibly powerful. Not only that, but knowing what your KPI are for your service will help you align what you want to do with your stakeholders' priorities. Very similarly to motivational interviewing, you got to know what motivates them, right? So thinking about what are your KPI for your service? Do you know what they are? And do you know how you're performing on them? I'm just going to kind of briefly touch on a few things here, but KPI, there's any number of them. And what are going to be the important ones will be dependent on your hospital, but they often fall into kind of revenue, operations, quality, and productivity. It's important to know exactly how it's actually calculated. For example, length of stay. You could do absolute days, just literally the number of days. Or more commonly, what hospitals will look at is the length of stay index. So the length of stay you're actually getting for your patients in your hospital versus the length of stay that would be expected for a similar patient, across the board in the country. And so there are national benchmarks for that, and you'll be kind of benchmarked against what's the average. And when it's in indices, most of the time you want to be less than, you want to be doing better than expected. There's also net collections rate. It's not just about collections, but rather how much are you actually receiving, even beyond what your hospital has negotiated for reimbursements. You may not be doing so well on that. And that's something important to know because it affects the bottom line. And then quality, I think we're all kind of a little bit more familiar with that. But then productivity, year-over-year growth is something that kind of globally for your service this year compared to the previous year, what was your growth? How much did you increase or not? Charges, numbers of patients seen, right? Like, how are you showing that you are growing? And then the ever-present relative value units. So RVU, it's not going to lie, it's complicated when it comes down to it, but essentially what you need to know is that it's the basis of how we get paid. It's made up of a couple of different components, the most important or most salient of which for us today is the physician work relative value unit. That is a proxy quantitative measure for how much of your time, skill, and training is required for care of a specific patient. It's going to be adjusted for geography. It's going to be then converted to a dollar amount with, a factor that CMS somehow figures out. But the important thing to know is that physician work RVU is a common productivity measure. So more and more now, this is what's determining whether or not we're being seen to do our job. And it's a common basis for compensation as well. So how you're getting paid and how much, it could be based on that. And it's important to have a relative understanding, because this is a great example where, let's say you do an inpatient initial eval and you code it with a 99223. The work RVU that will be assigned for that is 3.86. Now, if you do a follow-up and you code a 99231, the work RVU is 0.76. That means it's going to take about 5 follow-ups to get the same credit as a new eval. And in what we do, how often are our follow-ups actually taking longer than our new evals? If this is how you're being monitored and measured for your performance, it's not going to work in your favor. And it's important to know that. A few more things in terms of lingo. Full-time equivalent. It's essentially a way to kind of quantify work across multiple contexts. So one full FTE, one full-time equivalent of a physician, is approximately 40 hours. An easier way to think about it is, let's say you have a half day for transplant clinic. You have 0.1 FTE for transplant clinic. That is how hospital systems will see where your time is split. And understanding that is a key to discussing time and resources with them. Profitability is the concept of how revenue you generate, like how much your income is as compared to the cost of providing the service. And there are 2 main things that contribute to poor profitability. One is poor reimbursement rates, where how much you're literally getting paid for a service is less than how much it actually costs you to do it. And, that's kind of the story of our lives right now. The other part is having a high proportion of patients who are uninsured or otherwise unable to pay. Again, in what we do, these are a lot of the people we see. And so psychiatry and CL psychiatry tends to be a little bit, in a bit of a hole. So taking all that into account, which I know is a little bit of a whirlwind, but going back to knowing your service, one of the things that if I were to do this over again and had just were to become a new service chief, a question I would ask is it profitable? And actually just how is your service funded? What is your funding structure and model? The likelihood is you're not profitable. And so knowing that, you have to realize that from the hospital's perspective, anything you're going to request that requires more resources is basically going to dig you more into a hole, is going to make you less profitable. So think about how you're funded. Are you funded by department funds? Sometimes it's a psychiatry department who's just responsible, period, for providing CL service or whatever service line, regardless of what comes in, regardless of how your reimbursements are. Right? That's actually a pretty rough place to be in for a department. You might be lucky and you might have dedicated funding. Maybe you have a philanthropist or a former patient who, their lives were touched by someone on your service and they are insisting now there must be a psychiatrist on the prostate cancer service, right? That's a great place to be in. It's real nice. RVU-based collections, you basically have to pay for yourself. You have to put in charges and collect enough to pay for your overhead, for your salary. That's also, now knowing what we know about profitability, pretty hard. Right? A concept in service line funding is what's called cost shifting. And it's this idea that one group will overpay to compensate for a group that's underpaying. And one, example of this is self or cash pay patients who are going outside of kind of the insurance system may pay a higher rate. And that helps to cover the losses from patients who have insurances with poor reimbursement. While it sounds like, oh yeah, that makes sense, it's actually not so common. Something that's a little bit more economically sound is the idea of cost offset. And so offset is economic efficiency, where the savings you get from the service actually helps offset its cost. And an example is a social worker or case manager who's dedicated to your service. The decrease in the length of days that someone is just sitting waiting for a psychiatric bed may very well offset or possibly even pay for their time. What was most interesting to me as I kind of like got into all this is actually the concept of cross subsidization. So this is a concept where revenue from a profitable service subsidizes the revenue from an unprofitable service. And in hospital systems, it's hospital specific which service will be profitable and which will not, but it's predictable. It stays very predictable within a system. And this is actually based on like a lot of health economics research that's been done in the last like 5 to 10 years. The principal mechanism that it seems that hospitals provide services that are necessary, but really unprofitable, AKA us. Okay. And so this is literally kind of from their research and from their paper where psychiatry, substance abuse treatment, and trauma are actually consistently unprofitable services in hospital systems, but necessary. And so they are all offset typically by neurosurgery, cardiology, and oncology. And when you think about why, we think about profitability, right? Reimbursement and ability to pay, to reimburse. So knowing all this now, do your homework. Understand your funding structure and your profitability. Understand how your hospital system is going to see you when you are asking for more resources and what that means to them. Is it going to mean, digging yourself into a deeper hole? Is it going to mean taking more of a positive funding stream from a different service? What is that going to actually mean? Have hard data, have your KPI, and show your work, show the good work you do and the important things you do to support your initiatives. Learn the lingo, be able to talk to them, right? Be able to know what all these things are, the KPI, the length of stay indices, right? Know all that so that when you communicate to them, you're accurate and effective. And when you create your plan, do it knowledgeably and with the realization that, yes, there's the service and care needs, but there's also going to be the stakeholder priorities. And in reality, it's not always just about the bottom line. Stakeholders often do care about quality, about the care you are providing and meeting the needs of your community. They just have a better sense, honestly, on whether that's going to happen in a financially solvent way. And when you can think about it in that sense, you can partner together much more effectively. And then, so we're going to go from here, now that you've kind of gotten the basis of things, real life examples of how this plays out.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Cho, for that great talk. I am going to pick up on some of the concepts Dr. Cho was talking about and give a real life example of how this can play out in the real world. My specific case was the addition of a dedicated CL social worker to our service. So I was asking for an additional resource. And I am at New York Presbyterian Hospital, Weill Cornell. I have nothing to disclose. So the learning objectives here are to understand how to select and track quality metrics when advocating for additional staff, and also describing how to incorporate trainees in service development and administrations. So the ask here, as I mentioned, was a dedicated CL social worker. And in many ways, this is a tale of crisis and opportunity, which crises happen a lot when you're a CL director. This specific crisis was, of course, the pandemic. Our psychiatric unit closed during the pandemic to make room for COVID patients. And this was a huge problem for us because it's one of the few psychiatric units in the city that is within a medical setting and can actually accommodate pretty medically complex patients from our service. It's not a freestanding psych hospital. So it was a very important resource that we lost because we had fewer beds. The upside of this, the opportunity, was that the inpatient psychiatric social worker was actually redeployed to our service. So I decided that I was going to make use of this opportunity to track some metrics while we had a CL social worker, and then hopefully make an argument that this is something we need all the time, not just during the pandemic. So the task, tracking outcomes to get funding. As Dr. Bronson was talking about, of course, we care a lot about clinical outcomes, running our services more efficiently, patient care. And these are worthy goals, but often not a priority outside of our departments. Dr. Cho just talked at length about how CL services do not typically generate money by billing for clinical services. So given that, how do we demonstrate the ways in which we add value for the healthcare systems that we serve? And there's really no established consistent strategy for this. Tracking quality metrics in CL psychiatry is notoriously difficult. There's really no clear consensus on what to measure amongst ourselves. There's no standardized model for how to structure a service. And there's lots of strategies that can be used to measure performance, but these are often labor or time intensive. And that's where the trainees come in. I'll get to that in a little bit. Actually tracking these metrics themselves can require additional resources, administrative resources. So when making the pitch, really, and this is just not what we're trained with when we go into medicine, it's, as Dr. Bronson was talking about, when I started running the CL service, I really did not feel confident at all in business issues in CL psychiatry. So I kind of just took it upon myself to look at a lot of the resources available on the ACLP website, including some great columns that have been written by David Kroll about business and quality measures. And also exchanging ideas in the great group that Dr. Bronson has started, the CL division directors group, bouncing ideas off of fellow colleagues. But essentially, in my work, these are some concepts that I thought came up that were particularly important. And funders are really looking for a return on investment. There is actually a simple formula to describe this. But essentially it's the idea that, if you're putting in a cost, you want to get something out of it. And some institutions even have a hurdle rate, which is a minimum ROI, which they will consider eligible for funding a new service. If you are tracking an outcome, you have to show that, compared to the original model, your new model that you're suggesting or your new resource is going to either give you a better health outcome at the same cost or the same outcome at a lower cost. And specifically looking for pain points in the system in which you work. As Dr. Cho was mentioning, what do your particular stakeholders care about? Is it length of stay? Is it constant observation costs? Is it a non-psychiatry quality measure like medical readmissions? So figuring out what do your leaders care about at your hospital. So the outcomes that we specifically looked at were length of stay variant. At the time, this was something that people were very focused on, specifically days of delay between medical clearance and transfer to a psychiatric bed, also called dwell time. And Dr. Ackerman's also going to talk about that. And that was a real loss for the hospital, especially during the pandemic when we had fewer beds to use, people just basically sitting on medicine, taking up a bed. And then we also looked at medical readmissions, the percentage of patients with at least one medical readmission pre and post social work arrival on our service. So I talked earlier about how trainees can help in some of this work. And, it's not just that we're using trainees for free labor. Obviously, this is really important for them to learn about. I didn't learn about this as a trainee, and I did not feel well suited when I started in a leadership role to work on admin and business stuff. So I think this is a great way that we can actually involve trainees earlier in their training and understanding some of these important administrative concepts and business concepts in CL psychiatry. And also we learn in the process as well. So this was a quality poster that I ended up doing with 2 terrific trainees on my service, one of whom is currently an NYU CL fellow. So we basically we did a small cross-sectional observational study to look at whether the presence of the psychiatric social worker lowered the percentage of patients who were medically readmitted at least once. These are 30-day admissions. And then also looking at days spent waiting for a psychiatric bed post-medical clearance. And essentially the data was favorable. We showed that the embedded psychiatric social worker reduced the percentage of patients medically readmitted at least once, and also reduced the total amount of readmissions across the sample consult population. So, and Dr. Ackerman's going to talk about this more. You would think with such a beautiful data set, I got just what I asked for, handed in my lap. That was not the case. You know, there was maybe some rumblings of, okay, maybe we'll fund some part-time social work coverage, but I definitely did not get a 1.0 FTE social worker right away. And this is where you have to kind of go back to the drawing board. Shigeru Miyamoto, for those of you who don't know, is the head of Nintendo. And I had to get creative here. So how am I going to solve this problem? I want a full-time social worker. I'm not going to give up until I get that. So when you're a CL service director, you often feel like you have 99 problems. And if you want to feel old, this song is almost 20 years old, by the way. I looked that up while I was doing my slides and I was like, oh my God, I'm so old. Anyway, so I had multiple problems. I had no social worker. I had a nurse practitioner who was coming back from a leave and saying that she wanted to go part-time. And then I had the burn unit in my ear complaining that they lost we have we're a certified burn center at NYP Weill Cornell, and they had an embedded psychologist who did a lot of trauma screening, and that was how they got, that was something that they needed for their certification as a burn center. And they lost that person related to the pandemic, and they were upset they lost their funding for that. So since he left, they had been consulting us a ton for a lot of probably not great utilization of the psych CL service, like a lot of trauma screening that really, you didn't really need to be a psychiatrist to do, very easily could have been done by a social worker. So using this concept of practicing at the top of your license is also important. So what I did was I argued to redirect some of the funds from the nurse practitioner coming back part-time. So to take that chunk of time that had been paying for her full-time, redirect it towards the social worker, and then surgery via burn agreed to fund 0.5 FTE for a social worker to do their trauma screening. And that helped us in multiple ways. It will reduce the number of consults we get on the service from the burn unit that are not particularly educational or useful for us to do. We do get a lot of psychiatric consults on the burn unit, so having a social worker there will help us in terms of things like placement. They're often very difficult to place because of their extensive wound care needs. And then, of course, we have the our funding on general CL. So that was kind of our happy ending. We have this position now. My conclusions are that timing is everything. Crises may bring opportunities. Choosing quality metrics in CL is hard. When seeking to expand service lines, think about the funders and the stakeholders and what's in it for them. Involve interested and motivated trainees, and don't be afraid to share resources like we did with the burn unit. This idea of one hand washes the other is very important when you're a CL psychiatrist. These are my references. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for being here. I'm Mara Ackerman. I'm the director for the Consult Psychiatry Service at NYU Langone in Manhattan. Some background of how I got to this position. Actually, when I graduated CL fellowship, there wasn't an inpatient CL job in New York City. And so I took an outpatient job. And actually that outpatient job lended itself to quite a bit of administrative experience because I ultimately became the director for our outpatient psychiatry faculty group practice. And that was my education in business administration and ultimately my launching pad to go back to inpatient CL. So I still maintain 1 day a week, actually outpatient psychiatry. And then the rest of my time, I direct the CL service and see inpatients. So just as context for where this is coming from. I have no disclosures. And so why build a dashboard? Why are we going through the trouble? My colleagues have, I think, proved that there are lots of reasons to do so. Basically, show your work, right? We need to demonstrate what we're doing, or else it gets lost in the shuffle. We want to identify areas that we can grow and improve for ourselves in terms of like quality improvement. And of course, to communicate with other departments and hospital leadership and demonstrate the need for additional resources, which we know we all need at all times. And as Dr. Dickerman has illustrated, are really difficult to get. So this is an example of our metric card. So this is a sample. These aren't the actual numbers, but these are the actual metrics that we use. And I have to give tremendous credit to Dr. Rachel Caravella, who couldn't be at the meeting this year, but she's the associate director for our service. And she was the interim director at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the midst of running a CL psychiatry service in a crisis, she was asked to develop CL metrics and show the hospital why her service was valuable. And I've been fortunate to work with her and our administrative team to continue the process to develop these metrics and use them in real time. So the ways in which we use this metric card, we presented at our monthly service line meeting. I've presented at our IMC, which is the medicine administrative meeting that meets once a quarter. And various others. And so how do we choose what goes on the metrics card? So these are only a subset of the metrics that we actually do look at and are validated with our IT team. But the things that we use on the metrics card are, not surprisingly, the number of CL encounters that we do, which are pretty steady month to month. And we are using the percent of consults seen within 24 hours, which we try to hold ourselves to the 90%, which is a high metric. And I think we have done quite well on that. And that for the hospital is also really important. It's important for us and it's important for the hospital. So that's why that is there. And we are very fortunate to have a behavioral emergency response team at NYU. And that is comprised of a psychiatric nurse, a consult psychiatrist, we rotate of who responds to the emergencies, 4 security guards, and the primary team. So we also track the metrics for that service. So that time is non-billable. So again, capturing non-billable time is also crucial because as my colleagues have shown you, we don't really generate revenue. We cost the hospital system money, but we bring them value. And the BERT team is a major source of value and support for the primary teams on the floor and for the most challenging patients in the hospital. So we track the number of BERTs that we respond to. We track the number of safety huddles, which you can see below. Safety huddles are proactive huddles that we do with the primary teams for the highest acuity patients, those on security 1-to-1, those who had multiple BERTs. So again, we're talking to the hospital about the complexity of the work that we're doing and how we're helping the highest resource utilizers throughout the system. And then, of course, back to length of stay. So length of stay is just the key metric that leadership wants to talk about, as well as what we term dwell time. So dwell time is the time between medical clearance, which again, sometimes the team says the patient's medically cleared, and we might disagree. I imagine you've all been in that position just a few times. So we now timestamp when we agree the patient is medically cleared, and then we calculate the time between that timestamp note and when the patient physically leaves the hospital. And that's what we term dwell time. So that is something I talk about ad nauseum, I'd say, with leadership. So it's been really important for that to be validated and measured in a consistent way. And I would suspect that's one of the key metrics or KPIs for your institution as well. So then below, we also track the number of patients going to inpatient psychiatry, right? So how many patients at any given time are moving through the system. And this gets to throughput, which is another big buzzword for leadership throughout the hospital. What's the throughput? How do we move the patients faster? That's what they want to know. So, and then there are the patients that don't move at all. So the patients that we term psychiatric admissions to medicine, who are which we sort of invented this term, and it's not a validated term by any means, But for us, we needed to name the subgroup of patients who complete the duration of psychiatric admission on a medical floor, right? And especially with the pandemic, we all know there are major bed shortages, and these again are really high utilizer patients. And so how many of those patients are we seeing? And then our CL team, right, is serving as an inpatient psychiatry team, and those are so resource intensive. So we wanted to track those to be able to show leadership, this is what we're doing. This is how we're spending our time. So that is, I think, taking you through most of the important metrics. And then on the far right, we track acuity in terms of number of patients who've had more than 3 BERTs in the last month, patients with the orders for violent restraints, suicide precautions, and again, psychiatric transfers. So how do we use this data then to make our case? So there are a number of different ways, and I'll give you some real examples. So we all have data, or we should presumably have data on how much revenue we generate and also how many consults we do. So our service has grown exponentially. This is actually really our volume. So as you can see, from 2018 till now, we've exploded. And again, sort of highlighting at the top, our volume has increased almost 4 times in a 6-year period, but we've only had a 1.7 increase in FTEs. And actually, this includes fellow FTEs, not just attendings, because one way I had to talk to my leadership and my vice chair, who's very supportive, was we have gotten this year, we added a CL fellow. So we went from 3 CL fellows at NYU, who split time between NYU, Bellevue, and the VA, because we're a 3-site fellowship. And so we were able to advocate for a 4th fellow, which was excellent and has been a wonderful experience for us. And so when I initially drafted this slide, actually, I only put in attending time, because we all know fellows are phenomenal, but we're still supervising them at the end of the day. And my vice chair said, we have to show that they gave us something. We don't want to put out there and not acknowledge that we had an additional fellow line. And so that was the revision here. And I think it's just important to think about, you do need to know your audience and make sure that, you're honoring what they have given you, even if it's not totally what you want. So that's what you're showing here. So other things, talking about pressure points in the system. So where can we improve quality? Where can we improve throughput? So not surprisingly, the units that are the highest resource utilizers in terms of numbers of BERTs are the general medicine floors, where we all know we spend a lot of time, and the neurology and neurosurgery epilepsy service, where we're seeing the most BERT responses. And so talking to leadership about the fact that these units need more support. These are the places where the staff is struggling because of comorbid behavioral issues. They may not be psychiatric issues, right? It's often delirium, but these are the issues that need more support. How do we support them? And again, looking at factors that contributed to BERTs. So we were able to pull some data with the help of our BERT nursing team, which we're very fortunate to have, and show that the biggest offenders, if you will, were patients with delirium or neurocognitive disorder with behavioral disturbance. So these were not the patients who were waiting for psychiatric placement, right? That's often the hypothesis from leadership. It's those patients who need psychiatric admission. Those are the ones that are using up all the resources. Well, actually, in fact, not. It's true that those patients might use quite a bit of resources, but really it's patients with the aging population and with neurocognitive disorders who can't get placed in long-term care facilities. Those are the patients that are eating up resources. And we, as an institution, not just psychiatry, need to think about how do we help with throughput of those patients. And so again, the data helps us to inform these conversations. So here, again, hammering home this point. So thinking about the patients who had the most frequent BERTs, so the ones that had 11, 12, 14 BERTs, which again, so resource intensive, had the longest length of stay. And all 3 of these patients on the right side of the figure had neurocognitive disorders with behavioral disturbance. And again, we're not waiting for psychiatric admission. So I will say some success out of this story about neurocognitive disorders with behavioral disturbance. I was able to advocate for a 0.6 FTE. I wanted more, let's be real, for a neuropsychiatrist. And actually just last night, I got word that we have a candidate who's accepted that position. So I'm thrilled. So some successes, which is very exciting. And I think this data really was what helped us advocate for that, to show the hospital where we were going to be able to add value. But there are times when we strike out. So despite excellent data from Dr. Dickerman's team at Cornell and all of my best, I mean, I wrote this beautiful presentation, if I say so myself, about why a CL social worker was going to decrease dwell time, which everyone was talking about at every administrative meeting, how we were going to help connect patients to resources in the community, how we were going to move patients more quickly to inpatient psychiatry. And basically, the truth be told, the social work leadership team did not agree with me and feel very strongly that their model is to have floor-based social workers do the work. And they completely did not agree with the proposal for a social worker dedicated to one service, and actually went to the CMO around me and squashed my beautiful proposal. And as such, I struck out. And I'll tell you, I was not pleased. But such as it is, like, we got to move on. So, I mean, I haven't completely moved on or given up hope, but for now, I have to drop it, right? I'm in like a drop the rope place. And so we're going to have to make do. So a few more things. So beyond the dashboard, we all know that building the alliance is the first step, right? And so building the alliance as a leader in your department is relationship building. So as Dr. Cho was telling you, know who the leaders are and the structure of your organization, and also about in other departments. So another place we've been fortunate to really build allyship is in the Department of OBGYN. So pictured here are Dr. Jessica Vernon and Dr. Olivia Myrick, who are OBGYNs working on the front line. And they came to myself and Allie Deutsch, who's also here at the conference and on my CL team, and said, we really need to have more support for our patients with postpartum depression. And we've heard the story a million times. And yet we got lucky because when they started, there was a change in leadership in the Department of Surgery. And Dr. Dana Gossett is now their chair, and she is a champion of women's mental health. And so it is, right? It's all about timing. It's all about who's in a position of power. And Dr. Gossett said, you know, we've had this problem for always. This is not a new problem, but we're actually going to do something about it. And so we got buy-in. We got financial support. So OBGYN went in for, I think, 40% of a line for a women's mental health fellow, and psychiatry went in for 60%. And we felt like, you know, this is a partnership, not just in words, but in money, which is honestly really critical, right? Because services come to us all the time. We need a psychiatrist. Well, okay, but who's funding the line? And so here, OBGYN helped to fund this line, and we launched a Women's Mental Health Fellowship this year. So there's been one at Bellevue for a number of years, and now our fellows rotate at Bellevue and at NYU. And Allie Deutsch is doing a phenomenal job on the education side, but we're making this happen, and it's really wonderful service. And the way, though, again, you have to make it financially feasible. So the fellows are also working in our psychiatry FGP or faculty practice, and that's where they're generating revenue. So in this realm of the Dr. Cho talked about cost offsetting, that's where the cost offsetting happens, right? They're seeing patients basically in a private pay model through the faculty practice, generating revenue, and then they can spend some time doing CL consults, and they can spend some time in the OBGYN clinic because we're offsetting some of the cost. One other area is with transplant. Again, we all know there's so much need for dedicated transplant psychiatrists. I've been making that pitch since I started at NYU 7 years ago. The transplant volume at NYU has exploded. And again, this year there was a change in leadership. Dr. Bob Montgomery, who's had been the chair for transplant, became the complete chair of surgery. And lo and behold, he gave a 1 FTE for a transplant psychiatry, completely funded, again, by transplant psychiatry, not by psychiatry itself. So that, of course, has logistical implications of how do you structure those psychiatrists' time, and who do they report to, that you also have to think about. But it's been a tremendous value add, and I think speaks to the collaboration and the growth and relationship building, because I have been working with transplant for 7 years. And so I think it took that long to get to this funded line, and we're going to need more. We start with 1 FTE. If you see it, you can see the transplant volume here. It's really quite massive. So we'll need more, but I think this is the first step. And it sort of, again, to me, reinforces the principle of try again. So again, I will come back to the CL social worker. I don't know how many years it will take me. We'll see. Anna and I maybe we'll have like a duel. We'll see who gets there first, but eventually I'm going to get there. So I want to thank my team, this work I could not do without. They're fantastic. Many of them are here. will be at poster session, and hopefully some of you will get to meet them. And also our vice chair, who's been a tremendous mentor and support to me, Dr. David Ginsburg, our BERT nursing colleagues, and our administrative support team, who allow us to be able to develop and track these metrics and to take care of our patients. Thanks for your time.
Thank you guys for, and for my colleagues for the awesome presentation so far. Hopefully you've learned a lot about kind of the business side of psychiatry. My name is Cheryl Fleisch. I was previously at Vanderbilt and also at UF in Gainesville, Florida. And my interests have always been in value-based healthcare, providing care for folks who are underserved. And I ran a homeless psychiatry consultation service when I was at Vanderbilt, and much of my work there was proving to leadership, why were we actually valuable, and how do we run a service where we're basically seeing the entirety of our patients are uninsured. And then when I moved to UF in Gainesville, my work was basically kind of the opposite. My job was essentially to build a CL division, where I was the only CL psychiatrist there. And I was in a hospital where there were over 1,000 beds, and there were over 50 beds in the emergency room. And we had very few FTEs. Just recently, I moved because of my significant other. But one of the other interesting points was, how do you negotiate to remain at your other institution? How do you keep these FTEs? How can you do different things and utilize the negotiation skills that you have? I don't have any disclosures. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring you guys into a scenario, okay, where we have to utilize the skills that we have just learned. So you have this new job, and you are named the Chief of Consultation-Liaison Psychiatry at the University of the World's Best Hospital. And you see, the World's Best Hospital is well known to be strong in every specialty. And CL Psychiatry, it is no exception. See, you were hired to bring the already phenomenal WBH CLP to new heights. So there are some stats for your hospital. This is like one of those nonfiction fiction. This is actually not entirely based on my experience, but it is a quaternary care center. It has over 1,000 hospital beds. It has over 50 emergency room beds. So WBH CLP service, you cover the medical hospital and the emergency room. In the daytime, you have 3.5 FTE teaching attendings. You have 4 junior and senior residents, and you have 2 to 4 medical students. At night, you have 1 in-house resident, and you have an on-call by phone attending. So you accept this position, and then just as you start, one of your CL attendings, who's 0.5, says, you know what, I'm going to retire. And so because this attending is leaving, 1 resident is also going to be moved off service. I mean, after all, you don't need 4 residents. So when you start, there's going to be 3.0 FTE attendings, and it's going to be split between 3 inpatient CL attendings and 3 residents. You see, they took off the senior resident off of the service. So there are going to be 2 junior residents and 1 senior resident, and you're still going to have the same number of medical students. So, not too bad, not bad, passable, tolerable, all right. Things are going to be fine. So your task is to make us soar even more. This is a WBH model. So you meet with your colleagues and residents, and you find out the following. Resident satisfaction is low. Consultee satisfaction is low. And the remaining CL faculty are overwhelmed and burnt out. Wow. Gee, holy cow, geez, my gosh, Mama Mia. So you request some data from administration. So you get 2 years of data. And you've learned from all of these things that you went to this conference. I think it was called ACLP. Yeah. And so you get some of the data you requested. It was new and follow-up visits for the CL service for inpatient and ED. You get something called charges and collections for inpatient and ED, plus something called year-on-year growth. And you also get the total number of RVUs for the service for inpatient and the emergency room, plus the year-on-year growth for that. So in the meantime, over the next year, you're told that, individually, you exceed expectations. You're told that you are a great leader. In fact, you are the best attending. You're really wonderful. And, as a service, you have improved from last year. You have better resident and consultee satisfaction. You saw more patients, so you made more money. But there's still some problems. The faculty are actually pretty satisfied with your leadership as a whole, but they're still threatening to quit. So there's kind of this conundrum. You've done a pretty good job, but you still have faculty that are unhappy. They're unhappy about the overall patient volume. They're unhappy about the overall lack of teaching time that they have with trainees. And they're unhappy with the opportunities for incentive. That was pretty funny, I thought. That was a fail. There's always one fail. It's fine. I once put a rotten banana on a slide and thought it was super funny, and it was a total fail. So you request to meet with your chair, Dr. Fleisch, because you want to increase your CL psychiatry FTE. So you meet with Dr. Fleisch, and Dr. Fleisch says to you, you've really transformed the CL service. And listen, Dr. Fleisch is known to be pretty tough. So this is a really big compliment from the chair, Dr. Fleisch. And so you're like, thank you. And then Dr. Fleisch says, I'm so pleased that we're not going to have to make any adjustments in the FTE. You went into this meeting and you were honestly really expecting, something out of it. You actually really weren't expecting Dr. Fleisch to say that. That just wasn't the response. So you then have to kind of backtrack, and almost like a lot of my colleagues have said already, you sometimes have to rewind, right? Sometimes you have to think of your next approach to the situation. What are you going to do? How are you going to have to reform your data? A lot of us who have been in these situations before, in these leadership settings, have gone back to the table so many times to try to repitch before we went up the mountain and tried to figure out how we could get additional FTEs. So what we're going to have you do is we're going to provide you with handouts, and we're going to have you break into groups. And before we do that, I'm going to explain this. So we're going to have you utilize the data that is going to be provided to you to build a case to present to me, the chair of the world's best hospital. And we want you to figure out how to grow your service. So you're going to have to figure out, why do you need more than these 3 FTEs? And just to summarize, remember that you had 3.5, they'll start passing these out. Remember that you had 3.5 FTEs. The FTEs were then decreased to 3. You also had 4 residents, which were decreased to 3 residents. But in the meantime, honestly, you've been really good. You have exceeded expectations. Your service has kind of done better. You've really filled in all of the gaps, and your chair has noticed it. But unfortunately, you actually did so well that your chair feels like you don't need any additional FTEs. But now you have to argue, why do you need more than 3 FTEs? We've provided you with some data, and this is the data that was provided to you by your administration. But what other data would be helpful to you? Also, think about, who are your key stakeholders? What are they expecting in return? So these are the questions we would like for you to think about. This room isn't like the most conducive to groups. However, we're going to make it work. So what we'd like you to do, and we're going to make this happen. So we're going to figure out a way to split into 5 groups by simply the one row is going to turn their body around, I think, and one row is going to keep their bodies forward, hopefully. And we'll do this a few times so that magically there are 5 groups.
Got it?
There's actually growth on top of it. The growth is growing itself, right? So like the percent increase is actually here it's going like this. And I'm like, what other things that I mentioned, there's going to be a breaking point where even though you yourself are very happy with you're only one person and you can only be so I think
maybe they're medical here and then afterwards or sometimes there's this pressure. My husband, I love and facial order to be the condition. What about when ALS or something rely? You know, there was something that another very like. Yeah. And that even they just this is a very common they did require. You roll in and you're like, and then there's a big look at the page. Well, you know, what is the bathroom is a bathroom. And you grow out of one-offs. So you're getting a lot of one-offs. And which right, like back on I think you're right, just go out and wall you can pop up and watch out you follow up. So that's where and when I get done with like this, well, yeah. Because I feel like it's the most running back to the part of doing all of my services stuff, and then there's so many different factors that go and get them out. So they make possible, and it's obviously down. There's no doubt. Yeah, well, again, you got this because like you were gonna say, now you're fine.
We got it.
Anybody not been treated more that's what the deal is. So they all there's this person eating the wall, but it opens and number of people would also
Everybody else.
That is. So, right. Like, your owner, he's thinking money, it's not worker, and then also there's. And also. You know, when it. Maybe the base. Yeah. Like that's. Getting what time back from the. Like.
One of the ways. But I wondered how often you feel about. If we see them. Does that work against you? Right, you said sign on every 2 days. And you keep saying that it's something you're not in the city, we don't understand. It's dramatic.
Another year old and you're growing up. Because you're young, you're never in the hot.
They don't need the light, it's semi-lottery means, you know, they're not allowed. And
then we have like
Clear. Somebody's getting through the elevator.
Okay. I think we're gonna, yeah. Okay, everyone. I think we're gonna, this has been amazing energy, right? It's really amazing. I think we're gonna break up the groups. These groups have been very effective, and in a matter of minutes, you guys worked incredibly well, I think, as teams. It's really inspiring. It was, you know, much, yeah, so we probably could have gone forever. So
yes.
I'll give Cheryl a chance to come up. Actually, you guys. Why don't we do a few points and then we can see if there are questions. Cheryl's the most engaged in her group. All right, can everyone so maybe what we can do now is to try and sort of, like, now that you've practiced the you know, you've practiced the case, you've thought it through a little bit. So yeah, so I'm going to throw it to Cheryl and then maybe, yeah.
Sure. So we split up into the groups. We had a chance to talk about the case some. Why don't we'll start out with getting some opinions on this. So is there anybody, first off, is there any brave soul a very brave soul that's willing to have a short, say 2-minute negotiation with me. Okay. All right, Sean. I just met Sean.
I can trust you if you got it, Jen.
Okay, I'll, okay. Well, hello, Sean. Nice. Pleasure to see you for the first time in the last year. You know, I've heard that you've been doing, amazing. You've really transformed everything at the World's Best Hospital. Love to see that. Love.
I think we're all aligned on that. We both value excellence in patient care. That's what we do at the World's Best Hospital. And, despite unprecedented circumstances, the pandemic and losing our faculty and some of our residents, we still managed to exceed a lot of our expectations. And could you imagine what we could have done with even the same amount of faculty or even more?
No.
Okay.
I like that in you, son. One of the main reasons that we hired you here at the World's Best Hospital. We like people who think big and broad, and like that large statue outside of my window that I get to look at every morning. And one of the things I like about you is in these really challenging times, I noticed from the data, I talked to Sally, our administrator, and what she pointed out to me was a couple of really important things. It looked like you had stagnated this last year, but I know you better, Sean. I know that you didn't stagnate here, Sean. I noticed that you had lost that 0.5 FTE. I know that Schmendrick, that he retired, but you didn't need him, Sean. You didn't need him here. You were able to do it without him. And I foresee moving forward that with your leadership, we can do it. And 3.0 FTE and the residents that we currently have, Sean, I really think that we're on towards the wave of the future.
Yeah, you know what? You bring up a lot of great points, and
I did.
And if you think about this, right? We have inpatient unit. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of medically complex patients. We're billing higher for that. Also, our payer mix is much more. We can collect more off those. But I think we are prioritizing a lot of that. Unfortunately, a lot of our volume is going directly to the emergency room, and you can see. We look at like the visits, we stagnated a bit on inpatient, but for ED visits, we almost doubled the amount of patients we've seen.
Sally didn't bring that up. That's a very nice point there, Sean.
Yeah, including unique visits, and our issue is.
Why do you think that's that way, Sean? Why do you think we doubled the emergency room, Sean?
A lot of reasons, well, especially in COVID, right? You're having more people coming in for COVID. You're having a lot of downstream sequelae of people not being in touch with their outpatient care as a result. You're also having a lot of people who are not having follow-up medical care, and therefore.
What do you suggest we do about this, Sean?
I think we need some more staffing, honestly.
Is staffing the solution to this problem, Sean?
Not the whole solution. I think that's a short-term solution. Long-term solution, we need to think about a more innovative care model for our ED. We need to think about how we're leveraging other parts of our expertise, whether that's more like an embedded consult model.
Tell me more, Sean. What else would you propose for the emergency room, Sean?
Yeah. Well, a lot of emergency room too is pretty algorithmic as well. So we could think more about proactive consults.
4 letters, Sean, 4 letters. What are the 4 letters I'm thinking of? It starts with a T. And then an L. And then an E. Oh. Maybe. So Sean, I think that. So if you tele, I think we could do tele, let me ask you this, Sean.
Yeah.
If we did tele in the emergency room, do you think it would reduce the need for more people? Could we hire out to like say our other outpatient folks that we already have? And then, you know, we could have them call into the emergency room and then we wouldn't even have to hire more people. I think you just brought up a great idea.
We should, yeah, if we can, especially for our people on the floor here, right? If we can really preserve their bandwidth to see these medically complex patients, anything we can do to offload some of that ED burden. Would be really helpful in my service.
Patients who are really violent and agitated in AD, how are you handling those by tele?
That's true. We're not.
So, what does mean? So I was, oh my goodness, sorry. So I was really obviously impossible and very hard. But I will say that a lot of times, a lot of people in this room will recognize that a lot of times, like we talked about, you have to go back and back and back. And a lot of times your chairs and you feel like you've come from every angle. And a lot of times you feel like, I didn't bring up that idea just then. And how did you just think I brought up that idea, you know, about tele or something? And you're like, I didn't just say that. You know, and you'll have things that happen like that on a not infrequent basis. And those kinds of things can become very challenging. What you have to do is you have to draw on the inspiration of what that person said. So, and it may not happen in that moment. I thought what he did was actually very excellent. He did such a good job without having, you know, a significant amount of time, you know, or a significant amount of data. But the last thing I would say is, like, let's pretend that the chair in your department was super tele-focused, right? And that was like, you could tell every time you talked to them, they were like, and so we should do tele in the emergency room. And what about tele? And what about this? Then one strategy that you can have is your focus is to have more FTE, and you know that you need FTE. But your chair is like, we can have tele and we can have tele and we can have tele. So then figure out different strategies, as my colleagues have pointed out, to how can you somehow partner with the emergency room, let's say, and have, you know, get a 1.0 FTE and borrow a half FTE or something to do this and that and the other thing, and somehow offset your own burden in the emergency room so that you can use more of your staff for inpatient or something like that. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. The other thing that I was telling my group is that a lot of times you'll be given data and it will literally look like this. Okay. This is the actual data that was handed to you. It will be in a form. It'll be tiny. It'll be in a form that your brain doesn't connect with it, and you'll just be like, I have no idea what that means. A lot of us have like used different things. We've used resources on ACLP. We've used Google and YouTube and probably all sorts of stuff because none of us have our MBA. Okay. Right. Right. That's why we made it this title. Yeah. Oh. And so, but the point is that you can use these strategies that, you know, we've done over the years without having significant expertise previously in the business space to become extremely strategical and figure out cool methods to actually sort of get what you want from these things. We have no time left. If you have any questions, we'll be free afterwards to discuss. Thank you.